The radio crackled with static, then silence, dead silence. In that moment, standing in the middle of what had become the most critical military operation in decades, I realized that 300 soldiers were looking at me, not at the generals, not at the colonels with their chest full of medals, but at me, Captain Zara Blackwood, the girl they'd written off as too quiet, too soft, too unremarkable to matter. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. My single word would either save them all or doom an entire region to chaos. The weight of that moment pressed down on my shoulders like the desert heat itself, but my voice, when it came, was steady as granite. Phoenix. The irony wasn't lost on me that the very family who had spent years questioning my life choices was now watching CNN, seeing their disappointing daughter being interviewed about the most successful counterintelligence operation in military history. But to understand how I got there, you have to understand where I came from, and the slow, methodical way I learned that sometimes the quietest voice in the room carries the most power. Growing up in the Blackwood family meant living in the shadow of excellence, or at least their version of it. My older brother Marcus was the golden child, a Harvard-educated investment banker whose success was measured in seven-figure bonuses and penthouse apartments. My younger sister Vivian had followed the family script perfectly, becoming a prominent defense attorney whose cases made headlines and whose victories were celebrated at every family gathering. Then there was me, Zara, the middle child who chose the military over law school, who spent her weekends studying tactical manuals instead of shopping with her sisters, who preferred the company of fellow cadets to the country club social events that defined our family's calendar. I remember the exact moment I knew I didn't fit their mold. It was Thanksgiving dinner, 3 years into my military career. The dining room was adorned with my mother's pristine china and crystal, everything arranged with the precision of a museum display. My father, Judge Hamilton Blackwood, sat at the head of the table like a king holding court, his silver hair perfectly styled, his judicial robes replaced by an expensive cashmere sweater that probably cost more than my monthly salary. The conversation naturally gravitated toward Marcus, who was regaling us with stories of his latest merger deal, something involving telecommunications companies and figures that made my parents' eyes light up with pride. Vivian chimed in with her recent courtroom victory, defending a pharmaceutical company in a high-profile liability case. Her confidence was magnetic, her success undeniable. When the spotlight inevitably turned to me, the atmosphere shifted. It became cooler, more polite, the way adults talk to children about their finger paintings, encouraging but fundamentally dismissive. "And what about you, Zara?" my mother asked, her voice carrying that particular tone reserved for uncomfortable topics. "Still playing soldier?" Playing soldier. 3 words that encapsulated everything my family thought about my career. Not serving my country, not protecting freedom, not developing skills that could save lives. Playing. I tried to explain my recent assignment to a joint task force, a complex intelligence operation that involved coordinating with multiple allied nations, but I could see their eyes glazing over. My father interrupted before I could finish. "That's nice, dear," he said, already reaching for the wine bottle. "Marcus, tell us more about that bonus structure you mentioned." Just like that, I was erased from the conversation, my accomplishments dismissed as the hobbies of someone who couldn't find a real career. My brother and sister exchanged a look, not malicious, but pitying. Poor Zara, still trying to prove herself in a world that didn't matter. That night, lying in my childhood bedroom with its faded posters and outdated furniture, I made a decision that would define the next chapter of my life. I wasn't going to waste energy trying to translate my world for people who had already decided it wasn't worth understanding. Instead, I would excel so completely, so undeniably, that translation would become unnecessary. The next morning, I packed my bags and returned to Fort Braxton, a sprawling military installation in the high desert of Nevada, where the real work happened. This was my sanctuary, a place where competence mattered more than connections, where your value was measured by your ability to execute under pressure, not your ability to navigate cocktail party conversations. Fort Braxton was a world unto itself, a community built on shared purpose and mutual respect. The landscape was harsh and unforgiving, endless stretches of sand and rock broken only by the occasional Joshua tree, all of it baked under a sun that seemed personally invested in testing human endurance. But there was beauty in that harshness, a clarity that came from stripping away everything unnecessary. My commanding officer was Colonel Patricia Martinez, a woman whose reputation preceded her like a force of nature. She had come up through the ranks the hard way, earning every promotion through a combination of strategic brilliance and unshakable integrity. She was the kind of leader who inspired loyalty not through fear, but through competence so profound that following her felt less like obedience and more like privilege. The first time she called me into her office, I thought I was in trouble. Instead, she offered me coffee and asked about my background in linguistics and cultural studies, skills I had developed almost by accident, driven by a curiosity about how people communicated across barriers of language and culture. "Captain Blackwood," she said, her voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to being heard, "I've been reviewing your file. Your test scores are exceptional, but what interests me more is your psychological profile. You have a rare combination of analytical intelligence and emotional intuition. That's exactly what we need for a project I'm developing." She pulled out a classified folder, its contents hidden behind a cover sheet marked with security classifications I had never seen before. "We're developing a new approach to asymmetric warfare, something that relies less on traditional military superiority and more on understanding human psychology and social dynamics."
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
"I want you to lead the research team." That project became my life for the next 2 years. While my family continued to see me as their disappointing daughter who was playing soldier, I was developing revolutionary strategies for non-kinetic warfare, ways to achieve military objectives without firing a shot, methods for turning enemy assets into allies through precisely calibrated psychological operations. My team was small but exceptional. Lieutenant James Chen was a cybersecurity specialist whose understanding of digital warfare was matched only by his ability to think 3 moves ahead of any adversary. Sergeant First Class Maria Rodriguez brought field experience from multiple deployments, along with an intuitive understanding of how real soldiers thought and acted under pressure. Staff Sergeant David Kim was our communications expert, a man who could establish secure networks in environments where traditional infrastructure had been destroyed. Together, we worked in a secured facility buried 3 levels beneath the main base, our days spent analyzing patterns of human behavior, developing profiles of enemy leadership, and creating scenarios where minimal intervention could produce maximum strategic advantage. It was chess played on a global scale, with real lives hanging in the balance. The work was classified beyond most people's clearance level, which meant that even within the military community, few people understood what we were doing. To my fellow officers, I was the quiet captain who disappeared into the basement every day and emerged only for mandatory meetings and physical training. They respected my rank, but I could see the questions in their eyes. What exactly did Zara Blackwood do all day? This professional isolation mirrored my personal isolation, creating a dual existence that my family would never understand. At home, I was the disappointment who had chosen an incomprehensible career path. At work, I was the specialist whose contributions were too classified to discuss. In both worlds, I existed in a space defined by other people's inability to see me clearly. But Colonel Martinez saw me. She understood not just my capabilities, but my potential. During our weekly briefings, she would challenge me with scenarios that pushed the boundaries of conventional military thinking. What if we could end a conflict by convincing the enemy leadership that their own subordinates were planning a coup? What if we could neutralize a terrorist network by making them doubt each other's loyalty? What if the most powerful weapon wasn't a bomb or a bullet, but a perfectly timed piece of information delivered to exactly the right person? These weren't academic exercises. Every scenario we developed was tested, refined, and added to a growing database of strategies that were being quietly implemented around the world. Success in our field was measured not by the battles we won, but by the battles we prevented, not by the enemies we destroyed, but by the enemies we turned into assets. My family's dismissal of my career had always stung, but as my expertise deepened, their ignorance began to feel less like a personal failing and more like a strategic advantage. If my own family couldn't understand what I was capable of, how could enemy intelligence services predict my actions? My invisibility was becoming my greatest asset. The breakthrough came during my 3rd year at Fort Braxton. We had been tasked with developing a comprehensive profile of a terrorist organization operating in the mountains of a small Eastern European country. Traditional military approaches had failed because the enemy knew the terrain better than we did, and their support network was too deeply embedded in the local population to root out through conventional means. My team spent months analyzing intercepted communications, building psychological profiles of key leadership figures, and mapping the complex web of relationships that held the organization together. What we discovered was that the group's strength, their close-knit, family-like structure, was also their greatest vulnerability. The leader, a man known only as the Wolf, had built his organization around personal loyalty rather than ideological commitment. His followers weren't driven by religious extremism or political conviction, they were driven by personal relationships and economic necessity. This meant that the right pressure, applied to the right individuals at the right time, could cause the entire structure to collapse from within. But first, we had to test our theory. Colonel Martinez authorized a limited field operation, a chance to put our research into practice under controlled conditions. It would be my first time outside the laboratory, my first chance to prove that our theoretical frameworks could produce real-world results. The mission took me to a forward operating base in a desert region where the boundary between friendly and hostile territory shifted like sand dunes in the wind. It was a harsh environment, but not unlike the desert where I had trained, and I found the familiar heat oddly comforting. Here, surrounded by soldiers who judged each other based on competence rather than family connections, I felt more at home than I ever had in my parents' house. My role was to serve as a liaison between the intelligence team and the field commanders, translating our analytical findings into actionable strategies. It should have been a straightforward assignment, a chance to prove the value of our research in a low-risk environment. Instead, it became the defining moment of my career. The crisis began on a Tuesday morning with an intelligence report that changed everything. Our target organization hadn't just remained active despite months of conventional military pressure, they had evolved, adapting their tactics in ways that made them more dangerous than ever. Worse, intelligence indicated they were planning a major operation that would destabilize the entire region and potentially trigger a larger conflict involving multiple nations. The traditional response would have been to escalate our military presence, to meet force with greater force. But our analysis suggested that escalation would only strengthen the enemy's position by validating their narrative of being heroic resistors against foreign oppression. Instead, I proposed something radical. A single, precisely calibrated intervention that would exploit the organization's psychological vulnerabilities. Not a military strike, but a communication operation so subtle that the enemy wouldn't even realize they were being manipulated until it was too late. The plan required perfect timing, flawless execution, and a level of psychological insight that bordered on mind reading. It was the kind of high-risk, high-reward strategy that could either end the conflict decisively or make it exponentially worse. Colonel Martinez was intrigued but cautious. "Captain Blackwood," she said during our final planning session, "you're asking me to bet everything on a theory. If you're wrong, we don't just fail, we make the problem unsolvable." I understood the weight of her concern, but I also understood something she couldn't see from her position in the command structure. This wasn't just theory anymore. I had spent 3 years studying not just this organization, but the fundamental patterns of human behavior that made such organizations possible. I knew their leader better than he knew himself, understood his fears and motivations with a clarity that came from months of careful analysis. "Ma'am," I said, my voice steady despite the magnitude of what I was proposing, "respectfully, this isn't a gamble, this is applied science. We know how he thinks, we know what he fears, and we know exactly what information will make him question everything he believes about his own organization." She studied me for a long moment, weighing my confidence against the enormous risks involved. Finally, she nodded. You have 24 hours to set up your operation. If it doesn't work, we go with the conventional approach. 24 hours. Not enough time to doubt myself, barely enough time to implement the plan we had spent months developing. But as I prepared for what would become the most important day of my career, I felt a strange sense of calm. This was what I had trained for, what I had dedicated my life to understanding. My family thought I was playing soldier. They had no idea I was about to rewrite the rules of modern warfare. The operation began at dawn, in a communications bunker located in a fortified compound several miles from the main base. The bunker itself was a marvel of military engineering, a concrete and steel chamber buried deep enough to survive a direct missile strike, filled with equipment sophisticated enough to intercept, decrypt, and manipulate communications anywhere in the world. My team had worked through the night to set up the technical infrastructure we would need. Lieutenant Chen had established secure channels to multiple intelligence databases, giving us real-time access to information about every member of the target organization. Sergeant Rodriguez had coordinated with field assets, positioning human intelligence sources to observe and report on the enemy's reaction to our operation. Staff Sergeant Kim had created a communication network so secure that even our own command structure wouldn't be able to monitor our activities in real time. The plan itself was elegant in its simplicity. We would feed carefully crafted information to 3 different sources within the enemy organization, each piece of information designed to create doubt about the loyalty of the other sources. Not lies exactly, but selective truths presented in ways that would trigger pre-existing paranoia and suspicion. The Wolf had built his organization on personal relationships, but those relationships were also fragile, held together by constant reassurance and validation. If we could make him question the loyalty of his closest advisors, the entire structure would begin to collapse under the weight of its own suspicion. But the operation required more than technical precision. It required a deep understanding of human psychology, an ability to predict how specific individuals would react to specific types of stress. This was where my years of study would either validate themselves or prove worthless. At exactly 0800 hours, I initiated the first phase of the operation. Using intercepted communication protocols, I began feeding information into the enemy's network, each message carefully crafted to appear as if it came from within their own organization. The messages weren't dramatic or obviously alarming. Instead, they were subtle, the kind of minor discrepancies that would only be noticed by someone already looking for signs of betrayal. The first message suggested that one of the Wolf's lieutenants had been asking suspicious questions about operational security. The second implied that another lieutenant had been meeting secretly with local tribal leaders. The third indicated that weapons and supplies were disappearing from secure caches. Each message was individually meaningless, but together they painted a picture of an organization riddled with potential traitors and security breaches. More importantly, each message was designed to appeal to the Wolf's specific psychological profile, his tendency toward paranoia, his need for absolute control, his fear of being betrayed by those closest to him. The response was immediate and exactly what our analysis had predicted. Within hours, intercepted communications showed that the Wolf had begun questioning his inner circle, demanding explanations for activities that were either innocent or fabricated entirely. His paranoia was becoming a virus, spreading through the organization and turning allies into suspects. But this was only the first phase. The real test would come when the Wolf began taking action based on his suspicions. Would he respond with the kind of internal purge that would destroy his organization from within? Or would he recognize the manipulation and adapt accordingly? The answer came faster than we had expected. By afternoon, our field assets reported that the Wolf had ordered the detention of 2 of his most trusted lieutenants. Not execution, that would come later, if our psychological profile was accurate, but detention for enhanced questioning about their recent activities. This was the critical moment. If our analysis was correct, the detained lieutenants would respond to interrogation by implicating each other and additional members of the organization, creating a cascade of suspicion that would tear the group apart. If we were wrong, the Wolf would realize he was being manipulated and take steps to counter our operation.
I found myself holding my breath as we waited for the next intelligence reports. Around me, my team worked with quiet intensity, monitoring multiple communication channels and cross-referencing every piece of information against our predictive models. The bunker was filled with the soft hum of electronic equipment and the barely audible sound of operators speaking in hushed tones into secure microphones. Colonel Martinez had given me operational control, but I could feel the weight of her scrutiny even though she wasn't physically present.
Somewhere above us, in the main command center, she was monitoring our progress and preparing contingency plans in case our approach failed. The conventional military response was ready to deploy at a moment's notice, but once we escalated to traditional warfare, the opportunity for a clean resolution would be lost forever. The breakthrough came at 16:30 hours, when intercepted communications revealed that the detained lieutenants had indeed begun implicating each other. More importantly, they had provided information about other members of the organization who they claimed were acting suspiciously. The Wolf's paranoia was metastasizing exactly as we had predicted, turning the organization's greatest strength, its tight-knit structure, into a source of existential weakness. But we weren't finished yet. The final phase of the operation required the most delicate touch of all. We needed to provide the Wolf with information that would make him question not just his subordinates, but his own judgment. This was the psychological equivalent of performing surgery on a live grenade. One wrong move would cause everything to explode. The key was a piece of intelligence about the Wolf's own communication security. Our analysis had revealed that he had been using the same encryption protocols for over 2 years, long enough for sophisticated adversaries to have potentially compromised his systems. This wasn't manipulation, it was a genuine security vulnerability that we had discovered during our research. The challenge was how to deliver this information in a way that would maximize its psychological impact. We needed the Wolf to realize that if his communications were compromised, then the recent intelligence about his subordinates' disloyalty might itself be part of an enemy operation designed to destroy his organization from within. But rather than making him more suspicious of external manipulation, this realization would create an even deeper level of paranoia. If he couldn't trust his communications, if he couldn't trust his intelligence sources, if he couldn't trust his closest advisors, then who could he trust? The answer, according to our psychological profile, was no one. At 1800 hours, I transmitted the final piece of the puzzle. Using the same compromised channels we had been exploiting all day, I sent a message that appeared to come from an external intelligence service, congratulating an unnamed asset within the Wolf's organization for the success of their infiltration operation. The message was deliberately vague, providing no specific details about the identity of the supposed asset or the nature of their contributions, but it was specific enough to confirm the Wolf's worst fears: that his organization had been penetrated, that his trusted lieutenants might be enemy agents, and that the recent wave of suspicious activity might be part of a coordinated effort to destroy him. The response was swift and catastrophic. Within 6 hours, the Wolf had ordered the execution of 4 of his top lieutenants and the detention of a dozen other members. But rather than strengthening his position, these actions triggered a rebellion among the remaining members, who realized that no one was safe from their leader's paranoia. By dawn the next day, the organization had effectively ceased to exist as a coherent fighting force. Some members had fled into the mountains, others had surrendered to government forces, and still others had turned against each other in a desperate attempt to prove their loyalty to a leader who was no longer capable of trusting anyone. The Wolf himself was found dead in his compound, apparently having taken his own life rather than face capture by his former subordinates, who had finally recognized that their survival depended on removing him from power. The entire operation had taken less than 24 hours and had resulted in the complete neutralization of a terrorist organization that had resisted conventional military pressure for over 2 years. No shots were fired, no soldiers were killed, and no civilian infrastructure was damaged. It was, according to every metric that mattered, a perfect victory. But the real impact of the operation wouldn't be felt for several more hours, when news of our success reached the highest levels of military and political leadership.
Suddenly, everyone wanted to understand how a small team of specialists had accomplished what entire divisions had failed to achieve. The answer was simple, but also revolutionary. We had recognized that in an age of information warfare, the most powerful weapons weren't bombs or bullets, but ideas and perceptions carefully deployed to exploit human psychology. We had proven that understanding people, really understanding how they think, what they fear, what motivates them, could be more effective than any traditional military strategy. More importantly, we had demonstrated that this kind of warfare could be conducted with surgical precision, targeting specific individuals and organizations without causing the collateral damage that made conventional military operations so politically costly. The implications were staggering. If our methods could be refined and systematized, they could fundamentally change how conflicts were resolved, making it possible to achieve strategic objectives with the massive human and economic costs associated with traditional warfare. But even as I celebrated our success with my team, I couldn't shake the feeling that something larger was about to change. The operation had been too successful, too clean, too perfect. Word would spread through the military hierarchy, and with that attention would come both opportunities and challenges I wasn't prepared for. I was right to be concerned. Within 72 hours of our success, I found myself summoned to Washington for a classified briefing with senior Pentagon officials. The small, secure world I had built at Fort Braxton was about to collide with the much larger, much more complicated world of national security policy. My flight from Nevada to Washington was my first time leaving the desert in over a year, and the transition felt jarring. The lush green landscapes of the East Coast seemed almost alien after so much time in the stark beauty of the high desert, and the humidity was oppressive after months of dry heat. But the real shock came when I arrived at the Pentagon. The building itself was exactly what I had expected: massive, imposing, filled with the kind of bureaucratic energy that comes from housing the nerve center of the world's most powerful military. What I hadn't expected was the reaction my arrival would generate. I was escorted through secure corridors by a full colonel I had never met, past offices filled with officials whose faces I recognized from news broadcasts and congressional hearings. These were people who shaped national security policy, who advised presidents and testified before Congress, who made decisions that affected the lives of millions. And they wanted to meet me. Not Colonel Martinez, not my commanding officer, not any of the senior officials who outranked me. They wanted to meet Captain Zara Blackwood, the quiet girl who had just revolutionized modern warfare. The briefing room was smaller than I had expected, but filled with more stars and eagles than I had ever seen in one place. At the head of the table sat General Patricia Hawthorne, the first woman to serve as chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, a legend whose career had inspired a generation of female officers. She was smaller than she appeared on television, but her presence filled the room in a way that made physical stature irrelevant.
When she spoke, everyone listened, not because they had to, but because experience had taught them that she was usually right. "Captain Blackwood," she said, her voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed without question. "I've read the reports of your operation. What you accomplished in 24 hours would have taken us months using conventional methods, and the strategic implications are enormous." She paused, studying me with the kind of intense focus that comes from a lifetime of evaluating people under pressure. "I'm told that this operation was based on research you've been conducting for over 2 years. I want you to walk us through your methodology, your theoretical framework, and your assessment of how these techniques might be scaled up for larger operations." For the next 3 hours, I presented our research to an audience that included some of the most senior military leaders in the country. I explained our approach to psychological profiling, our methods for identifying organizational vulnerabilities, and our techniques for exploiting human cognitive biases to achieve strategic objectives. The questions they asked were sophisticated and probing, revealing a deep understanding of both the potential and the dangers of the kind of warfare we were developing. These weren't academics interested in theoretical discussions, they were practitioners who needed to understand how our research could be translated into operational capabilities. At the end of the briefing, General Hawthorne asked me to remain behind while the other officials filed out. When we were alone, she poured 2 cups of coffee from a service that had clearly seen better days and sat down across from me in a gesture that somehow transformed the formal briefing room into something more intimate. "Captain," she said, her voice softer but no less intense, "what you've developed isn't just a new tactical approach, it's a new form of warfare, and like all revolutionary military technologies, it's going to change everything." She leaned forward, her eyes holding mine with an intensity that made looking away impossible. The question is whether we're going to control that change or be controlled by it. Right now, you and your team are the only people who truly understand these techniques. That gives us an advantage, but it also makes us vulnerable. I wasn't sure what she meant, but her next words clarified everything. Other nations are developing similar capabilities. Our intelligence indicates that several hostile powers have teams working on psychological warfare techniques that could be used against us. We need to stay ahead of that curve, which means we need people like you in positions where they can shape policy and strategy. She pulled out a folder that I hadn't noticed before, its contents hidden behind the kind of security classification that my research looked like casual reading. "I'm offering you a choice, Captain. You can return to Fort Braxton and continue your research, developing new techniques and refining existing ones. That's important work, and we need people doing it." She opened the folder, revealing documents that my security clearance seemed quaint by comparison. "Or you can come to Washington and help us figure out how to integrate these capabilities into our national security strategy. It's more political, more visible, and infinitely more complicated, but it's also where the real decisions get made." The choice she was offering wasn't just about my career trajectory. It was about whether I wanted to remain a specialist developing weapons in a laboratory or become a strategist helping to decide how those weapons would be used. It was the difference between influencing tactics and shaping policy. But there was another dimension to the choice that she hadn't explicitly stated. Taking the Washington position would mean leaving behind the comfortable anonymity I had cultivated, stepping into a world where my work would be subject to political scrutiny and public debate. The quiet girl who had spent years developing revolutionary capabilities in secret would have to become a public figure defending those capabilities in congressional hearings and policy forums. I thought about my family, still convinced that I was playing soldier in some inconsequential corner of the military. I thought about my colleagues at Fort Braxton, who respected my work but didn't fully understand its implications. I thought about the enemy organization that had destroyed itself because they couldn't distinguish between reality and carefully crafted perception. "Ma'am," I said, my voice steady despite the magnitude of the decision I was making, "I've spent my entire career studying how information and perception shape reality. If I'm going to help develop policies around these capabilities, I need to understand how they work in the political arena as well as the military one." She smiled, the first time I had seen her expression soften since I entered the room. "I hoped you would say that, Captain, or should I say, Major Blackwood." The promotion was effective immediately, along with a new assignment to a joint task force responsible for developing doctrine around what was already being called cognitive warfare. My office would be in the Pentagon, my clearance would be upgraded to levels I hadn't known existed, and my work would directly inform national security policy. But the real change wasn't in my rank or my responsibilities, it was in my visibility. For the first time in my career, my work would be subject to scrutiny from outside the military chain of command. Congressional oversight committees would want briefings, academic researchers would want to study our methods, foreign intelligence services would want to understand our capabilities. The quiet girl was about to become very loud indeed. My first day at the Pentagon was a masterclass in bureaucratic complexity. The building itself was a maze of corridors and offices, each one representing a different aspect of American military power.
My new office was located in a section dedicated to emerging threats and advanced capabilities, surrounded by people whose job descriptions sounded like science fiction, but whose work was deadly serious. My immediate supervisor was Brigadier General Michael Chen, Lieutenant Chen's older brother, and one of the Pentagon's leading experts on information warfare.
The family resemblance was obvious, but where Lieutenant Chen was focused on technical capabilities, General Chen understood the strategic and political implications of those capabilities. Major Blackwood, he said during our first meeting, your research has created more excitement and more concern than anything we've seen in years. The excitement comes from the obvious strategic advantages of your approach. The concern comes from the fact that we don't yet have adequate frameworks for governing the use of these capabilities. He pulled up a presentation on his secure monitor showing a series of scenarios that made my successful operation look simple by comparison. We're developing doctrine for conflicts involving multiple adversaries using cognitive warfare techniques against each other and against us. We need to understand not just how to use these weapons, but how to defend against them and how to control their proliferation. The challenges he outlined were staggering in their complexity. Unlike conventional weapons, cognitive warfare capabilities couldn't be controlled through traditional arms limitation treaties. The same techniques that could neutralize a terrorist organization could be used to manipulate domestic political processes or undermine allied relationships. The line between legitimate intelligence operations and attacks on democratic institutions was becoming increasingly blurred. My job was to help develop policies that would allow us to maintain our strategic advantages while preventing these capabilities from being used in ways that would undermine the values we were supposed to be protecting. It was the kind of ethical and strategic balancing act that required not just technical expertise, but a deep understanding of political and social dynamics. The work was intellectually stimulating in ways that my research had never been. Instead of focusing on specific targets and operations, I was thinking about entire categories of conflict and the long-term implications of the capabilities we were developing. But it was also frustrating in ways I hadn't anticipated. In the laboratory, success was measured by results. An operation either worked or it didn't. A strategy either achieved its objectives or it failed. In Washington, success was measured by consensus, and consensus required compromises that often diluted the effectiveness of the policies we were trying to develop. But I was learning skills that would prove invaluable when the real test came. I was learning how to communicate complex technical concepts to political audiences, how to build coalitions around controversial policies, and how to navigate the intricate relationships between military effectiveness and democratic accountability. Most importantly, I was learning how power really worked in Washington. Technical expertise was important, but it was only one factor in a much larger equation that included political relationships, institutional loyalty, and public perception. The people who succeeded in this environment weren't necessarily the smartest or the most competent. They were the ones who best understood how to translate their expertise into political influence. I had been in my new position for 6 months when the crisis that would define my career began to develop. Intelligence reports indicated that a hostile nation was preparing to use cognitive warfare techniques against one of our closest allies, an operation that could destabilize an entire region and potentially trigger a larger conflict. The operation was sophisticated beyond anything we had previously encountered, suggesting that our adversaries had made significant advances in their own cognitive warfare capabilities. Traditional diplomatic and military responses would be inadequate, but the scale and complexity of the threat was beyond what any small team could address. This wasn't a problem that could be solved in a communications bunker with a handful of specialists. It would require coordination between multiple agencies, cooperation with allied intelligence services, and resources on a scale that would make my previous operation look like a training exercise. But most challenging of all, it would require a public commitment to capabilities that had previously been classified beyond public acknowledgement. Congress would need to be briefed, allies would need to be consulted, and the American people would need to understand why their government was developing weapons that existed in the realm of psychology rather than physics.
The briefing that would change everything took place on a Thursday morning in October in a secure conference room deep beneath the Pentagon. Present were the Secretary of Defense, the Director of National Intelligence, the Chairman of the Joint Chiefs, and a handful of other officials whose names would be recognizable to anyone who followed national security policy. I had been invited to present our assessment of the threat and our recommendations for addressing it. It was the kind of opportunity that junior officers dream about, a chance to brief the highest levels of government on a crisis that could reshape international relations. But as I prepared for the briefing, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was about to cross a line from which there would be no return. Once these capabilities became part of public policy discourse, there would be no putting them back in the classified bottle. The quiet girl who had developed revolutionary weapons in secret was about to become the public face of a new form of warfare. The briefing itself went smoothly. I presented our analysis of the threat, explained the limitations of conventional responses, and outlined a comprehensive strategy for countering cognitive warfare attacks using our own advanced capabilities. The questions were sharp and well-informed, revealing that senior policymakers had been following developments in this field more closely than I had realized. But the real moment of truth came at the end of the briefing, when the Secretary of Defense asked the question that everyone in the room had been thinking. "Major Blackwood," he said, his voice carrying the weight of someone who had spent decades making decisions that affected the lives of millions. "What you're proposing isn't just a military operation, it's a fundamental change in how we think about conflict and deterrence. Are you confident that we can control these capabilities once we deploy them on this scale?" The room fell silent, every eye focused on me. These weren't my colleagues at Fort Braxton or my research team who understood the technical details of what we were discussing. These were the people who would have to justify our actions to Congress, to allies, and ultimately to the American people. I thought about my family, still oblivious to the work I was doing. I thought about my brother and sister, whose definitions of success seemed quaint compared to the responsibilities I was being asked to accept. I thought about the enemy organization that had destroyed itself because they couldn't distinguish between truth and manipulation. And I thought about the 300 soldiers who would be depending on my ability to mobilize an entire battalion with a single word, to coordinate resources and capabilities on a scale that would determine the outcome of a conflict that could reshape the global balance of power. "Sir," I said, my voice steady despite the magnitude of what I was about to commit to, "we've spent years developing these capabilities precisely because we understood that others would eventually develop them too. The question isn't whether we can control these capabilities, it's whether we can afford not to use them when our adversaries already are." The secretary nodded slowly, understanding the implications of what I was saying. In the world of cognitive warfare, the first move advantage could be decisive, but so could the willingness to escalate when escalation became necessary.
We're recommending a coordinated response involving multiple allied nations, I continued, pulling up a classified presentation that outlined the scope of what we were proposing. This isn't just an American operation, it's a demonstration of collective resolve in the face of a new kind of threat. The presentation I showed them was the culmination of months of planning, a comprehensive strategy that would involve intelligence services from 7 different countries, coordination with diplomatic missions around the world, and the deployment of cognitive warfare capabilities on a scale that had never been attempted. The target wasn't just the hostile nation preparing to attack our ally, it was the entire network of relationships and assumptions that made such attacks possible. We would demonstrate that cognitive warfare could be met with overwhelming cognitive force, that attempts to manipulate democratic institutions would be countered with precision strikes against the decision-making processes of authoritarian regimes. But the operation would require resources that exceeded anything my small research team could provide. We would need analysts who could work in dozens of languages, technicians who could maintain secure communications across multiple time zones, and field operatives who could function effectively in environments where traditional military support wasn't available. Most critically, we would need a command structure that could coordinate activities across multiple agencies and allied nations while maintaining the operational security necessary to prevent our adversaries from detecting and countering our activities. The Director of National Intelligence leaned forward, his expression reflecting both the possibilities and the dangers of what we were discussing. Major, you're talking about mobilizing intelligence assets on a scale that approaches what we do for conventional military operations. The coordination requirements alone would be staggering. He was right, and I had spent weeks thinking about exactly that challenge. Conventional military operations succeeded because they operated within established command structures and utilized well-understood protocols. What we were proposing would require creating entirely new organizational frameworks, developing real-time coordination mechanisms, and training personnel in capabilities that most of them had never encountered. Sir, I replied, we've already begun developing the organizational framework. The challenge isn't technical, we have the capabilities we need. The challenge is coordination, and coordination is fundamentally about communication. I pulled up another slide, this one showing a proposed command structure that looked more like a corporate organizational chart than a traditional military hierarchy. At the center was a coordination cell that would serve as the nerve center for the entire operation, receiving intelligence from multiple sources, analyzing threats in real time, and dispatching resources to address emerging challenges. The key insight, I explained, is that cognitive warfare operations succeed or fail based on timing and precision. We need a command structure that can make decisions and implement them faster than our adversaries can adapt to changing circumstances. The chairman of the Joint Chiefs studied the organizational chart with the expression of someone trying to solve a complex puzzle. Major, what you're describing sounds less like a military operation and more like a real-time intelligence fusion center. How do we ensure that the people making tactical decisions understand the strategic implications of their actions? It was exactly the right question, and one that went to the heart of why I had been brought to Washington in the first place. In conventional warfare, the strategic and tactical levels of operation were clearly separated. Strategic decisions were made by senior commanders based on political objectives, and tactical decisions were made by field officers based on immediate circumstances. But cognitive warfare compressed those timelines and blurred those distinctions. A tactical decision to release specific information at a particular moment could have strategic implications that wouldn't become apparent for days or weeks. The person making that decision needed to understand not just the immediate tactical situation, but the broader strategic context in which they were operating. Sir, I said, that's why we're proposing a new model of command and control, one that integrates strategic and tactical decision-making in real time. Every operator in the field will have direct access to the strategic intelligence they need to understand the implications of their actions. I advanced to the next slide, showing a communication network that looked like something from a science fiction movie. Secure channels connected analysts in Washington to field operatives in dozens of countries, allowing for the kind of real-time coordination that traditional command structures couldn't provide. The technology already exists, I explained. What we're proposing is using it to create a new kind of military organization, one that can think and act at the speed of information rather than the speed of traditional bureaucracy. The silence that followed was the kind that comes when people are processing ideas that challenge their fundamental assumptions about how organizations work. These were individuals who had spent their careers mastering traditional command structures, and I was asking them to approve something that would require throwing out decades of organizational wisdom. Finally, the Secretary of Defense spoke. Major Blackwood, assuming we approve this operation, what would be your role in the command structure you're proposing? It was the question I had been dreading because it forced me to confront the reality of what I was asking for. The organizational structure I had designed required someone at its center who understood both the strategic implications of cognitive warfare and the tactical details of how individual operations were conducted. There were very few people who had that combination of knowledge and experience. In fact, there was really only one person who had been involved in developing the theoretical framework, planning successful operations, and working at the policy level to understand the broader implications of these capabilities. That person was sitting in a Pentagon conference room, explaining to the highest levels of government why they should approve the most ambitious intelligence operation in American history. Sir, I said, feeling the weight of the moment settling on my shoulders, the command structure requires someone who can integrate strategic intelligence with tactical implementation. Based on the current state of expertise in cognitive warfare, I believe I'm the most qualified person for that role. I wasn't being arrogant, at least I didn't think I was.
The assessment was based on an objective analysis of the skills and experience required for the position. But I also understood that what I was proposing would transform me from a junior officer developing new capabilities into the operational commander of a multinational intelligence operation. The implications were staggering. If the operation succeeded, I would become one of the most influential intelligence officers of my generation, someone whose innovations had fundamentally changed how democratic nations defended themselves against cognitive warfare. If it failed, I would be responsible for a debacle that could undermine American credibility and potentially trigger the very conflicts we were trying to prevent. General Hawthorne, who had remained silent throughout most of the briefing, finally spoke. Major, you're asking us to bet the future of cognitive warfare doctrine on an operation that has never been attempted, using organizational structures that have never been tested, under the command of an officer who has never led anything larger than a small research team. Her words weren't a criticism, they were an accurate assessment of the risks involved.
Everything about the operation was unprecedented, from the scale of coordination required to the speed at which decisions would need to be made. Traditional military wisdom suggested that such complex operations should be tested incrementally, with each phase building on the lessons learned from previous phases. But cognitive warfare didn't allow for incremental approaches. The window of opportunity for preventing our adversary's attack was measured in weeks, not months. If we waited to test our organizational concepts and refine our coordination procedures, the crisis we were trying to prevent would become a reality. Ma'am, I replied, respectfully, that's exactly why this operation needs to succeed. We're not just countering a specific threat, we're demonstrating that democratic institutions can adapt to new forms of warfare faster than authoritarian regimes can deploy them. I advanced to the final slide in my presentation, showing projected outcomes based on different response strategies. The analysis was sobering. Conventional diplomatic responses had a low probability of success and would likely escalate the crisis. Traditional military responses would be effective but would carry enormous risks of triggering larger conflicts. The cognitive warfare response we're proposing has the highest probability of resolving the crisis without escalation, I explained, but only if it's implemented with sufficient speed and coordination to overwhelm our adversary's decision-making processes. The Secretary of Defense studied the projections for a long moment, weighing the risks and benefits of each approach. Finally, he looked up from the briefing materials and fixed me with the kind of stare that comes from someone who has spent a lifetime making decisions that affect the fate of nations. Major Blackwood, he said, if we approve this operation, you will have access to intelligence assets and coordination authorities that most general officers never see. You will be making tactical decisions that could have strategic implications for multiple allied nations. Are you prepared for that level of responsibility? The question forced me to confront something I had been avoiding throughout the briefing process. Up until this moment, my work had been conducted in the relative safety of research environments and controlled operational settings. The consequences of failure had been manageable, the scope of responsibility clearly defined. What I was being offered was something entirely different. I would be responsible not just for the success or failure of a single operation, but for proving that the capabilities we had developed could be scaled up to address threats that could reshape international relations. The quiet girl who had spent years working in classified obscurity was being asked to step onto the world stage and demonstrate that American cognitive warfare capabilities were superior to those of our adversaries. I thought about my family's dismissive attitude toward my career, their inability to understand that the work I was doing had real-world significance. I thought about my colleagues at Fort Braxton, who had trusted me with their research and their reputations. I thought about the democratic institutions that would be targeted by our adversaries if we failed to demonstrate effective countermeasures. Sir, I said, my voice carrying a confidence I hoped I actually felt. I've spent the last 5 years of my career preparing for exactly this kind of challenge. The research we've conducted, the operations we've planned, the organizational structures we've developed, they've all been building toward this moment. I paused, looking around the room at the faces of people who would ultimately be held accountable for the consequences of whatever decision they made. I understand the risks, and I understand the responsibilities.
But I also understand that if we don't act now, with the capabilities and the organizational advantages we currently possess, we may not get another opportunity to demonstrate that cognitive warfare can be conducted in ways that protect rather than undermine democratic values. The discussion that followed lasted for another hour, covering operational details, authorization procedures, and oversight mechanisms. But the fundamental decision had already been made. The United States would launch the largest cognitive warfare operation in history, and I would be in command of the coordination cell that would make it succeed or fail. The formal authorization came 3 days later, in the form of a classified directive that gave me authorities I hadn't known existed and access to resources that exceeded anything I had imagined. Within a week, I was moved to a secure facility in Northern Virginia, a complex of buildings hidden behind corporate facades and surrounded by security measures that made my previous work environment look casual. The facility itself was a marvel of modern intelligence architecture. 3 stories above ground housed what appeared to be a generic technology consulting firm, complete with corporate logos and reception areas that could fool even sophisticated surveillance. But 5 stories below ground was a coordination center that could manage intelligence operations anywhere in the world. The heart of the facility was a command center that looked like something from a Hollywood movie about futuristic warfare. Wall-mounted displays showed real-time intelligence from dozens of sources, secure communication channels connected us to allied intelligence services around the world, and analytical workstations allowed our team to process information and develop responses faster than had ever been possible. But the real innovation wasn't technological, it was organizational. Instead of the traditional military hierarchy that separated planners from operators, our structure integrated strategic analysis with tactical implementation in real time. Analysts who developed strategic assessments could communicate directly with field operatives who would implement those assessments, creating feedback loops that allowed us to adapt our approach as circumstances change. Building this organization required recruiting personnel from across the intelligence community, identifying individuals who had the technical skills we needed, but also the intellectual flexibility to work in an environment where traditional organizational boundaries didn't apply. It was like assembling a team for a sport that hadn't been invented yet, using criteria that couldn't be found in any manual. My core team included some of the most talented individuals I had ever worked with. Dr. Sarah Chen, Lieutenant Chen's sister, was a cognitive psychologist who understood how information processing changed under stress. Captain Michael Torres was a communication specialist who could establish secure networks in environments where traditional infrastructure had been compromised. Major Lisa Kim was a cultural anthropologist who could predict how different societies would respond to specific types of information. But perhaps most importantly, Colonel Martinez had agreed to serve as my deputy commander, bringing the kind of operational experience and institutional credibility that would be essential when we began coordinating with allied intelligence services. Her presence legitimized the entire operation, signaling to skeptics within the intelligence community that this wasn't just an academic exercise, but a serious operational capability. The first phase of the operation involved establishing secure communication channels with our counterparts in allied nations, a process that proved more complex than we had anticipated. Each country had different procedures for authorizing intelligence cooperation, different standards for operational security, and different comfort levels with the kind of cognitive warfare capabilities we were proposing to deploy. The British were immediately supportive, recognizing the strategic advantages of demonstrating collective resolve in the face of cognitive warfare threats. Their intelligence services had been developing similar capabilities, and they saw our operation as an opportunity to test coordination mechanisms that could be used in future crises.
The Germans were more cautious, concerned about the historical associations of psychological warfare and the potential for these capabilities to be used in ways that could undermine democratic institutions. It took weeks of careful diplomatic engagement to secure their participation, and even then, they insisted on oversight mechanisms that would ensure their involvement remained within strict legal and ethical boundaries. The Japanese approached the operation from a completely different perspective, viewing it primarily as an opportunity to understand how cognitive warfare capabilities could be used to counter threats from neighboring authoritarian regimes. Their participation was enthusiastic, but conditional on receiving detailed briefings about our methods and access to our analytical findings. Coordinating these different approaches while maintaining operational security required a level of diplomatic sophistication that I hadn't fully appreciated when we were designing the operation.
Each ally had legitimate concerns about sovereignty, legal authority, and public accountability, and addressing those concerns without compromising operational effectiveness became a constant balancing act. But gradually, over the course of several weeks, we succeeded in building a coalition that could deploy cognitive warfare capabilities on a scale that exceeded what any single nation could achieve independently. The coordination mechanisms we developed became a model for future operations, demonstrating that democratic nations could cooperate on intelligence operations without sacrificing the transparency and accountability that distinguish them from authoritarian regimes. The target of our operation was a sophisticated influence network that our adversary had been building for over 2 years, a complex system of media outlets, social media accounts, and human agents designed to manipulate public opinion in our allied nation. Traditional counterintelligence approaches had been partially successful in identifying individual components of the network, but they hadn't been able to map the entire system or understand how its different parts work together. Our approach was fundamentally different. Instead of trying to identify and neutralize individual agents or outlets, we focused on understanding the psychological and social dynamics that made the influence network effective. We analyzed how information flowed through the network, how different types of content were designed to appeal to specific audiences, and how the network's operators adapted their messaging based on real-time feedback about public response. What we discovered was both sophisticated and vulnerable. The influence network was designed to exploit pre-existing social divisions and psychological biases, using carefully crafted narratives to amplify existing tensions and create new sources of conflict. But this same sophistication made the network dependent on maintaining consistent messaging across multiple platforms and operators, creating vulnerabilities that could be exploited by adversaries who understood how the system worked. Our strategy was to introduce carefully calibrated disruptions into the network's information flow, creating inconsistencies that would undermine the credibility of their messaging and force their operators to make tactical adjustments that would expose the coordination mechanisms they were using. It was cognitive warfare conducted at the level of information architecture, targeting not just specific messages but the systems that made those messages effective. The operation began on a Monday morning in November, with coordinated activities across 7 time zones and involving intelligence assets from 4 different countries. Unlike my previous operation, which had been conducted from a single location over the course of 24 hours, this operation would unfold over several weeks and require constant adaptation as our adversaries responded to our activities. The complexity was staggering. We were simultaneously monitoring dozens of information channels, analyzing the responses of multiple target audiences, and coordinating activities with allied intelligence services that operated under different legal frameworks and organizational cultures. The command center operated around the clock, with analysts and operators working in shifts to ensure that we could respond to developments anywhere in the world at any time. But the real challenge wasn't technical, it was strategic. Each tactical decision we made had implications that rippled through the entire information environment, affecting not just our immediate targets, but the broader relationships between the populations and governments we were trying to protect. We had to be constantly aware of how our activities might be perceived by friendly audiences, ensuring that our efforts to counter hostile influence operations didn't inadvertently undermine the democratic values we were defending. The first week of the operation proceeded according to plan. We successfully introduced disruptions into our adversaries' information network, creating inconsistencies that forced them to adjust their messaging and coordination procedures. Our allied partners reported that the hostile influence activities in their countries were becoming less effective, with target audiences showing increased skepticism about the narratives they were being asked to accept. But success in cognitive warfare creates new challenges. As our adversaries recognized that their influence network was under attack, they began adapting their tactics, shifting to backup communication channels and modifying their messaging to account for the disruptions we were creating. What had begun as a straightforward operation to neutralize a specific threat was evolving into a complex, dynamic conflict conducted entirely in the realm of information and perception. By the second week, it became clear that our adversaries were more sophisticated than we had initially assessed. They had developed their own real-time coordination capabilities, allowing them to adapt to our activities faster than we had expected. More concerning, they were beginning to target not just the populations in our allied nation, but the coordination mechanisms we were using to conduct our own operations. Intelligence reports indicated that our adversaries were attempting to infiltrate our communication networks, identify our coordination procedures, and potentially disrupt our activities by feeding false information into our analytical processes. For the first time since the operation began, we were facing the possibility that our adversaries might be able to turn our own capabilities against us. This was the moment when all of my training, all of my research, and all of my experience in cognitive warfare would be tested under conditions that no simulation could replicate. We were engaged in real-time conflict with adversaries who understood our methods and were actively trying to counter them, while coordinating with allies who were depending on our ability to maintain operational security and strategic coherence. The solution required fundamentally rethinking how we approached the entire operation. Instead of trying to maintain a single, coordinated strategy across all allied nations, we shifted to a more distributed approach that allowed each country's intelligence services to adapt our methods to their specific circumstances while maintaining overall strategic coherence. This distributed approach had several advantages. It made our activities more difficult for adversaries to track and counter, since they would need to understand the operational procedures of multiple intelligence services rather than just our own. It allowed our allied partners to maintain greater control over activities in their own territories, addressing sovereignty concerns that had been limiting their participation. And it created redundancy that would allow the operation to continue even if individual components were compromised. But it also required a level of trust and coordination that stretched our organizational capabilities to their limits. We had to share analytical methods and intelligence findings with allied services while maintaining operational security. We had to ensure that distributed activities remained strategically coherent while allowing tactical flexibility. And we had to do all of this while adapting to countermeasures that our adversaries were implementing in real time. The third week of the operation was the most challenging of my career. Our adversaries had succeeded in disrupting several of our coordination channels, forcing us to shift to backup systems that were less efficient but more secure. Intelligence reports indicated that they were preparing their own cognitive warfare operations, targeting the domestic political systems of multiple allied nations, an escalation that would transform what had begun as a defensive operation into something approaching open information warfare. At the same time, political pressure was building. Congressional oversight committees were demanding briefings about our activities, allied governments were facing public questions about their participation in classified operations, and media reports were beginning to speculate about the existence of American cognitive warfare capabilities. The quiet operation that had begun in the secure facilities of Northern Virginia was becoming a matter of public debate, with implications that extended far beyond the immediate tactical objectives we were trying to achieve. Success was no longer just about countering a specific threat. It was about demonstrating that democratic nations could develop and deploy cognitive warfare capabilities without sacrificing the transparency and accountability that distinguish them from authoritarian regimes. It was during this period of maximum pressure that the crisis reached its climax. The Germans were more cautious, concerned about the historical associations of psychological warfare and the potential for these capabilities to be used in ways that could undermine democratic institutions. It took weeks of careful diplomatic engagement to secure their participation, and even then, they insisted on oversight mechanisms that would ensure their involvement remained within strict legal and ethical boundaries. The Japanese approached the operation from a completely different perspective, viewing it primarily as an opportunity to understand how cognitive warfare capabilities could be used to counter threats from neighboring authoritarian regimes. Their participation was enthusiastic, but conditional on receiving detailed briefings about our methods and access to our analytical findings. Coordinating these different approaches while maintaining operational security required a level of diplomatic sophistication that I hadn't fully appreciated when we were designing the operation. Each ally had legitimate concerns about sovereignty, legal authority, and public accountability, and addressing those concerns without compromising operational effectiveness became a constant balancing act. But gradually, over the course of several weeks, we succeeded in building a coalition that could deploy cognitive warfare capabilities on a scale that exceeded what any single nation could achieve independently. The coordination mechanisms we developed became a model for future operations, demonstrating that democratic nations could cooperate on intelligence operations without sacrificing the transparency and accountability that distinguish them.
Intelligence reports indicated that our adversaries were preparing to launch a comprehensive influence operation designed to destabilize the government of our allied nation, using techniques that would make their previous activities look like preliminary exercises. The operation they were planning would involve coordinated activities across traditional media, social media, and human intelligence networks, designed to create the appearance of widespread domestic unrest and government incompetence. If successful, it could trigger actual political instability that would achieve their strategic objectives without requiring traditional military intervention. Our assessment indicated that conventional counterintelligence methods would be inadequate to counter an operation of this scale and sophistication. The only effective response would be to deploy our cognitive warfare capabilities at maximum intensity, creating disruptions so comprehensive that our adversaries' information networks would lose the coherence necessary to achieve their objectives. But deploying our capabilities at this level would require revealing their existence to a degree that had never been attempted. The operation would be too large and too visible to maintain plausible deniability, and the techniques we used would inevitably become subjects of public debate and academic analysis. I was faced with a decision that would define not just the outcome of our operation, but the future of cognitive warfare as a tool of democratic defense. I could authorize limited activities that would maintain operational security but might not be sufficient to counter the threat we were facing. Or I could authorize comprehensive activities that would likely succeed tactically but would expose capabilities that might be more valuable if they remained secret. The decision required integrating tactical considerations with strategic implications in ways that no training had prepared me for. I was being asked to weigh immediate operational success against long-term strategic advantage, public accountability against operational security, and the specific interests of our allied nation against broader questions of how democratic societies should respond to cognitive warfare threats. Standing in the command center, surrounded by displays showing real-time intelligence from around the world and secure communication channels connecting us to allied intelligence services on multi-continents, I realized that this was exactly the kind of moment my entire career had been preparing me for. The quiet girl who had been dismissed as playing soldier was about to make a decision that would affect the future of warfare itself. And I knew, with the kind of certainty that comes from years of study and preparation, exactly what that decision needed to be. I walked to the primary communication console and opened secure channels to all of our allied partners simultaneously. When I spoke, my voice carried the authority of someone who had studied cognitive warfare longer and more intensively than anyone else in the room, but also the confidence of someone who understood that the moment for theoretical considerations had passed. "This is Major Blackwood," I said, my words being transmitted simultaneously to intelligence centers in Washington, London, Berlin, and Tokyo. "We are implementing Protocol 7. All stations prepare for comprehensive cognitive warfare deployment. Authorization code Phoenix. Execute immediately." The response was immediate and overwhelming. Across 4 countries and 7 time zones, the most sophisticated cognitive warfare operation in history began to unfold with precision and coordination that exceeded even our most optimistic projections. Within hours, our adversaries' influence networks began experiencing disruptions so comprehensive that their operators couldn't distinguish between technical failures and targeted attacks. But the real measure of success wouldn't be technical, it would be strategic. We weren't just countering a specific threat, we were demonstrating that democratic nations could deploy cognitive warfare capabilities faster and more effectively than authoritarian regimes could adapt to them. We were proving that the values of transparency and accountability that made democratic societies vulnerable to information warfare could also be sources of strength when those societies chose to defend themselves. The operation that followed would become a case study in advanced cognitive warfare, but more importantly, it would establish the framework for how democratic nations would defend themselves against information threats in the decades to come.
The quiet girl had finally found her voice, and when she spoke, the entire world listened. The 48 hours that followed Protocol 7's implementation redefined everything I thought I understood about warfare, politics, and family. While our cognitive warfare capabilities deployed across multiple continents with mathematical precision, something unexpected happened in the sterile corridors of the Pentagon and the secure communication channels connecting Allied intelligence services around the world. I became visible. Not in the way my brother Marcus was visible, with his name in financial newspapers and his photograph at charity galas. Not in the way my sister Vivian was visible, with her courtroom victories generating headlines and her legal opinions quoted in academic journals. I became visible in the way that only matters in the world of national security, where visibility means being the person that everyone else depends on when the stakes couldn't be higher. The first indication that something fundamental had changed came from General Hawthorne herself. 12 hours into Protocol 7, as our coordinated activities were achieving results that exceeded even our most optimistic projections, she appeared in our command center unannounced. Not through a scheduled briefing or a formal inspection, but through the kind of impromptu visit that signals when senior leadership recognizes that history is being made. "Major Blackwood," she said, her voice carrying an undertone I had never heard before, something that sounded almost like awe. "The preliminary reports from our allied partners are extraordinary. The hostile influence network isn't just being disrupted, it's being systematically dismantled in ways that will make reconstruction impossible for months, possibly years." She gestured toward the wall displays showing real-time intelligence from our operation, data streams that represented the most comprehensive cognitive warfare deployment in human history. "But more importantly, you've demonstrated something that defense analysts have been debating for decades. You've proven that democratic nations can coordinate advanced warfare capabilities faster and more effectively than authoritarian regimes could adapt to them. We were proving that the values of transparency and accountability that made democratic societies vulnerable to information warfare could also be sources of strength when those societies chose to defend themselves." The operation that followed would become a case study in advanced cognitive warfare, but more importantly, it would establish the framework for how democratic nations would defend themselves against information threats in the decades to come. The quiet girl had finally found her voice, and when she spoke, the entire world listened. The 48 hours that followed Protocol 7's implementation redefined everything I thought I understood about warfare, politics, and family. While our cognitive warfare capabilities deployed across multiple continents with mathematical precision, something unexpected happened in the sterile corridors of the Pentagon and the secure communication channels connecting Allied intelligence services around the world. I became visible. Not in the way my brother Marcus was visible, with his name in financial newspapers and his photograph at charity galas. Not in the way my sister Vivian was visible, with her courtroom victories generating headlines and her legal opinions quoted in academic journals. I became visible in the way that only matters in the world of national security, where visibility means being the person that everyone else depends on when the stakes couldn't be higher. The first indication that something fundamental had changed came from General Hawthorne herself. 12 hours into Protocol 7, as our coordinated activities were achieving results that exceeded even our most optimistic projections, she appeared in our command center unannounced. Not through a scheduled briefing or a formal inspection, but through the kind of impromptu visit that signals when senior leadership recognizes that history is being made. "Major Blackwood," she said, her voice carrying an undertone I had never heard before, something that sounded almost like awe. "The preliminary reports from our allied partners are extraordinary. The hostile influence network isn't just being disrupted, it's being systematically dismantled in ways that will make reconstruction impossible for months, possibly years." She gestured toward the wall displays showing real-time intelligence from our operation, data streams that represented the most comprehensive cognitive warfare deployment in human history. "But more importantly, you've demonstrated something that defense analysts have been debating for decades. You've proven that democratic nations can coordinate advanced warfare capabilities faster and more effectively than authoritarian regimes can adapt to them." What she didn't say, but what I could see in her expression, was that the implications extended far beyond our immediate tactical success. we had created a new model for how democratic societies could defend themselves against cognitive warfare, one that preserved the transparency and accountability that defined democratic governance while deploying capabilities that rivaled anything our adversaries could develop. But the real transformation wasn't happening in the secure facilities of Northern Virginia or the intelligence centers of allied nations. It was happening in a small restaurant in downtown Washington, where my mother sat with her morning coffee and opened her smartphone to find a news alert that would change her understanding of her daughter forever. The news report was carefully constructed to respect operational security while conveying the strategic significance of what had occurred. It described a coordinated multinational intelligence operation that had successfully countered sophisticated foreign influence activities targeting allied democratic institutions. The report mentioned that the operation had been commanded by a senior military intelligence officer whose innovative approaches to cognitive warfare had revolutionized defense capabilities. What made my mother's hands tremble as she read wasn't the technical description of cognitive warfare or the strategic implications of multinational coordination. It was a single sentence buried in the middle of the article, a sentence that contained my name, my rank, and a brief description of my role in developing the theoretical frameworks that had made the operation possible.
She called my father, who was in his chambers reviewing legal briefs for an upcoming case. She called Marcus, who was in a board meeting discussing quarterly projections. She called Vivian, who was preparing for a deposition that would determine the outcome of a high-profile liability case. Within an hour, my entire family was gathered in my father's study, reading and rereading the news report that had transformed their understanding of my career from embarrassing disappointment to incomprehensible achievement. The article included quotes from senior Pentagon officials describing my contributions to national security, references to classified research that had fundamentally advanced American intelligence capabilities, and speculation about my role in future defense policy development. For the first time in my adult life, my family was forced to confront the possibility that they had fundamentally misunderstood not just my career choice, but my competence and my significance within the institutions I had chosen to serve. The conversation that followed, which I wouldn't learn about until weeks later, revealed the depth of their confusion and the uncomfortable realization that their dismissive attitude toward my military service had been based on ignorance rather than insight. My father, accustomed to measuring success through judicial recognition and legal scholarship, struggled to understand how someone could achieve national prominence in fields he had never bothered to study. My mother, whose social identity was built around her ability to explain her children's accomplishments to friends and neighbors, found herself unable to translate cognitive warfare achievements into the kind of conventional success metrics her social circle would understand. Marcus and Vivian, both of whom had spent years assuming that their achievements in finance and law represented more sophisticated and important career paths than military service, were forced to confront articles describing their sister as an expert in capabilities they hadn't known existed, working on problems they couldn't comprehend. But while my family was struggling to reconcile their assumptions with emerging realities, I was dealing with a different kind of visibility, one that came with responsibilities and pressures I hadn't fully anticipated. The success of Protocol 7 had attracted attention at levels of government I had never expected to encounter. Within 72 hours of the operation's completion, I found myself summoned to the White House for a briefing with the National Security Council, a room where the theoretical frameworks I had spent years developing would be translated into policies that would affect millions of people. The White House briefing room was smaller and more intimate than I had expected, but filled with individuals whose names I recognized from news broadcasts and policy journals. The National Security Advisor, the Secretary of State, the Director of the CIA, and the Chairman of the Joint Chiefs were all present, along with several deputies whose expertise in regional affairs and international law would be essential for understanding the broader implications of our operation. But the most significant presence in the room was the President herself, Dr. Catherine Morrison, a former university president whose academic background in international relations had prepared her to understand the strategic significance of cognitive warfare capabilities. She had requested the briefing personally, recognizing that the success of Protocol 7 represented a turning point in how democratic nations would approach information security. "Major Blackwood," she began, her voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to making decisions that affected the entire world,
The intelligence reports from our allied partners describe your operation as the most successful cognitive warfare deployment in history. But I'm more interested in understanding the implications for how we defend democratic institutions going forward. The question revealed the sophistication of her thinking about the challenges we were facing. Protocol 7 had been tactically successful, but its real significance lay in demonstrating that democratic nations could develop, deploy, and control cognitive warfare capabilities without sacrificing the transparency and accountability that distinguished them from authoritarian regimes. Madam President, I replied, what we've demonstrated is that cognitive warfare can be conducted in ways that strengthen rather than undermine democratic values. Our success depended on coordination with allied partners, oversight by elected officials, and operational frameworks that preserved legal and ethical constraints. I pulled up a presentation that summarized not just the technical aspects of our operation, but the governance mechanisms that had made it possible. The key insight is that democratic societies have institutional advantages in cognitive warfare that authoritarian regimes can't replicate. Our ability to build trust with allied partners, maintain public accountability, and adapt to changing circumstances faster than hierarchical command structures allows. The discussion that followed lasted for over 2 hours, covering everything from budget allocations to treaty obligations to congressional oversight requirements. But the fundamental conclusion was clear. The United States would invest in cognitive warfare capabilities as a permanent component of national security strategy, with institutional frameworks designed to ensure that these capabilities remain compatible with democratic governance. More immediately, I would be promoted to lieutenant colonel and assigned to establish a new directorate within the Pentagon, one responsible for developing doctrine, training personnel, and coordinating with allied partners on cognitive warfare operations. It was the kind of career advancement that typically took decades to achieve, compressed into a single conversation because the strategic importance of cognitive warfare had been demonstrated so convincingly. But the promotion came with responsibilities that extended far beyond military command structures. I would be testifying before congressional committees, briefing international partners, and serving as a public spokesperson for capabilities that had previously been classified beyond public discussion. The quiet girl who had spent years working in secure facilities would become the public face of American cognitive warfare capabilities. The transition was both exhilarating and terrifying. Within a month, I had moved from a secure facility in Northern Virginia to offices in the Pentagon that were designed for visibility rather than secrecy. My staff included not just intelligence analysts and communications specialists, but public affairs officers and congressional liaisons, whose job was to translate our technical capabilities into language that elected officials and journalists could understand. The first congressional hearing was scheduled for a Tuesday morning in January, in a committee room that would be filled with representatives whose understanding of cognitive warfare ranged from sophisticated to non-existent. I would be responsible for explaining not just what we had accomplished, but why these capabilities were necessary for defending democratic institutions against emerging threats. The hearing itself was a masterclass in the intersection of technical expertise and democratic accountability. Committee members asked questions that revealed both the promise and the dangers of cognitive warfare capabilities, forcing me to articulate not just how these tools work, but why democratic societies could be trusted to use them responsibly. The most challenging question came from Congressman James Martinez, a former prosecutor whose skepticism about expanded intelligence capabilities was well known. Lieutenant Colonel Blackwood, he said, his voice carrying the prosecutorial edge that had made him famous in criminal court, you're asking us to approve capabilities that could theoretically be used to manipulate domestic political processes. How do we ensure that these tools are used only against foreign adversaries? It was exactly the question that went to the heart of democratic governance in the information age. Cognitive warfare capabilities were inherently dual-use technologies, tools that could defend democratic institutions or undermine them depending on how they were deployed and controlled. Congressman, I replied, that's precisely why we've developed institutional frameworks that preserve congressional oversight, judicial review, and public accountability. The same transparency that makes democratic societies vulnerable to cognitive warfare also makes them more capable of controlling and directing these capabilities responsibly. I pulled up slides showing the oversight mechanisms that had been built into our organizational structure, legal frameworks that ensured congressional notification of major operations, judicial review of domestic implications, and public reporting requirements that would allow democratic institutions to maintain control over cognitive warfare capabilities. The key difference, I explained, is that authoritarian regimes develop these capabilities in secret and deploy them without oversight. Democratic societies develop them through transparent processes and deploy them with built-in constraints that reflect democratic values. The hearing continued for over 4 hours, with questions that covered everything from budget allocations to international law to the philosophical implications of information warfare. But by the end, it was clear that congressional support for cognitive warfare capabilities was strong, based not just on their tactical effectiveness, but on the institutional frameworks that ensured democratic control. The public response to the hearing was immediate and largely positive. Editorial boards praised the transparency of the briefing process, intelligence experts described the capabilities as essential for defending democratic institutions, and allied partners expressed confidence that American cognitive warfare development would strengthen rather than threaten international cooperation. But the response that mattered most to me came from an unexpected source. 3 days after the congressional hearing, I received a phone call from my father, the first direct communication I had received from my family since the news reports about Protocol 7 had been published.
Zara, he said, his voice carrying a tone I had never heard before, something that sounded like respect mixed with bewilderment. I watched your congressional testimony online. I have to admit, I didn't understand most of the technical details, but I understood enough to realize that what you've accomplished is extraordinary. He paused, and I could hear the difficulty he was having in finding words that would bridge the gap between his previous assumptions and emerging realities. Your mother and we never understood what you were doing in the military. We thought it was just a phase, something you would grow out of and move on to a more conventional career. The conversation continued for nearly an hour, with my father asking questions about cognitive warfare that revealed both his genuine interest and his growing understanding that my career choice had been based on insights about emerging threats that he was only beginning to comprehend. What I realize now, he said toward the end of our conversation, is that you understood something about the direction the world was moving that we completely missed. While we were focused on traditional measures of success, you were preparing for challenges that hadn't even been publicly acknowledged. The apology, when it came, was awkward but sincere. We were wrong, Zara, not just about your career, but about our inability to see what you were really accomplishing. You've achieved something that's genuinely historic, and we should have trusted your judgment instead of dismissing it. Similar conversations followed with Marcus and Vivian, both of whom had spent the weeks since Protocol 7 trying to understand how their sister had become a nationally recognized expert in capabilities they hadn't known existed. Their curiosity was genuine, but it was also tinged with the uncomfortable realization that their assumptions about the relative importance of their different career paths had been fundamentally incorrect. The family dynamics that had defined my childhood and early adulthood were being transformed by the simple recognition that competence and significance couldn't be measured using conventional metrics. The quiet daughter who had been dismissed as playing soldier had become the family member whose work was reshaping national security policy and international relations. But the real validation didn't come from family recognition or congressional praise or presidential briefings. It came from the secure communication that arrived on a Thursday morning in February, transmitted through channels so classified that only a handful of people had access to them. The message was from Colonel Martinez, who was now serving as my deputy director, but whose opinion mattered more to me than any official recognition. Zara, she wrote, I wanted you to know that the doctrinal frameworks we developed have been adopted by allied intelligence services on 3 continents. The organizational structures we created for Protocol 7 are being used as templates for cognitive warfare capabilities in friendly nations around the world. She continued, but more importantly, the personnel we trained during the operation have become the nucleus for a new generation of cognitive warfare specialists. The theoretical insights you developed in that basement laboratory at Fort Braxton are now being taught at military academies and intelligence training centers from London to Tokyo. The message concluded with an assessment that meant more to me than any medal or promotion or presidential commendation.
You haven't just contributed to national security, you've created an entirely new field of military science, with institutional frameworks that will protect democratic societies for decades to come. 6 months later, I stood before an audience of military officers and intelligence professionals from 23 countries, delivering a lecture at the NATO Defense College on cognitive warfare applications in multilateral operations. The lecture hall was filled with individuals who represented the future of democratic defense capabilities, officers who would spend their careers implementing and refining the frameworks we had developed. The questions they asked were sophisticated and challenging, revealing deep understanding of both the technical aspects of cognitive warfare and the institutional challenges of maintaining democratic control over advanced information capabilities. These were the people who would carry forward the work we had begun, adapting our methods to new threats and new circumstances while preserving the values that made democratic societies worth defending. As I concluded my presentation, I realized that the journey from that family Christmas dinner where I was dismissed as playing soldier to this international forum where I was recognized as a leading authority on cognitive warfare hadn't just been about personal validation. It had been about proving that democratic institutions could adapt to emerging threats faster and more effectively than anyone had believed possible. The quiet girl who had been underestimated by her family, overlooked by her peers, and dismissed by those who couldn't understand her career choices had found her voice in the most consequential way imaginable. When I spoke that single word, Phoenix, in the command center, I wasn't just authorizing a military operation. I was announcing that democratic institutions possessed capabilities that their adversaries couldn't match and values that their enemies couldn't undermine. The applause that followed my NATO lecture was polite and professional, exactly what I would have expected from an audience of military officers and intelligence professionals. But as I packed my materials and prepared to leave the podium, a young captain approached me with a question that reminded me why this work mattered. "Ma'am," she said, her voice carrying the earnestness of someone early in her career, "my family doesn't understand why I chose military intelligence over the civilian career they wanted for me. How do you explain to people who've never worked in this field that what we do really matters?" I looked at her, seeing something of myself from years earlier, someone whose competence and commitment were being questioned by people who couldn't understand the significance of the work she had chosen. "Captain," I said, "you don't explain it, you prove it. You become so undeniably competent at what you do that explanation becomes unnecessary. And when the moment comes that tests everything you've learned and everyone you care about depends on your expertise, you'll discover that all those years of being misunderstood were just preparation for the moment when being understood became essential." She nodded, understanding that the path she had chosen would require patience and persistence and the quiet confidence that comes from knowing that your work has meaning even when others can't see it. As I walked out of the NATO Defense College and into the crisp Brussels morning, I thought about that family Christmas dinner that seemed like a lifetime ago, when my father had dismissed my career as playing soldier and my mother had suggested I find something more conventional. They couldn't have known that their quiet daughter was preparing for challenges that would define the future of democratic defense, developing capabilities that would reshape international relations and strategic thinking. The underestimation that had once been a source of pain had become a source of strength, teaching me that the most important work often happens in silence, that the most significant achievements often go unrecognized until the moment when recognition becomes inevitable. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.